Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we are finally going to be talking about how to beat Blood Angels in Pariah Nexus as the Aeldari. So first of all, I do want to apologize for the length of time it made to make this video. It was going to be done sooner, but initially I had the video well over an hour and my phone just couldn't handle the download. So basically the file was corrupted upon completion and I had to start from scratch. So what I have decided to do is do two separate videos on this topic. One covering the battle report itself in more detail, on my computer. That will be, a separate kind of thing. And then this video is going to be the breakdown of how to defeat Blood Angels on the battlefield. So a lot of you are probably wondering at this point, what happened in your game against Blood Angels? Well, I'm happy to announce that I won the game, and not only that, but I won it by a pretty wide margin. And the reason for this is simply that I had a lot of time to prepare. I didn't know my opponent's list before the game, but because of, comments in the YouTube section, I watched, battle reports with, Blood Angels players, playing their armies. I was able to kind of figure out what the Blood Angels do best and how they typically position themselves in order to defeat their opponents. And what I noticed about these games is when the Blood Angels player was able to kind of charge what they wanted to, and, there was nothing really there to stop them from doing so, they did very well, and they won that game handily. However, when the opponent was able to screen effectively and prevent the Blood Angels player from getting the combats that the Blood Angel player wanted, then that game didn't go so well for the Blood Angels. So having known that, and also the data sheets, stratagems, enhancements, and of course the detachment rules of the Blood Angels, having a clear knowledge of all that stuff, I was able to pull off a pretty decisive victory against my opponent. And of course, if you do want a little bit more depth into the list that I brought into the game against Blood Angels, I do have that video up on YouTube as well. All right, so without further ado, let us go ahead and dive right into the video overview. So what we're going to be talking about today is the Blood Angels, right? So possible detachments, stratagems, and key enhancements that the Blood Angels will often bring against you, their strongest and most common units available to them and their Aeldari counters, effective strategies to employ when going up against the Blood Angels, and lastly, my recent experience against Blood Angels and what I learned in that game. Okay, so let's go ahead and start off with the Red Thirst, which is the Blood Angels Sons of Sanguinius detachment bonus. Basically, every time they make a charge move, they add +2 strength to their melee weapons and +1 attack, which is pretty insane if you think about it. So, units with power fists go up to strength 10, and they get an extra attack on top of that. Basically, this means that anything they charge into in the Eldar roster is going to die a horrible death. Wraith Blades and Wraith Guard included. And I think this is throwing a lot of players off because, they have these big bricks of Wraith Guard and all of a sudden they're being taken out by a couple of Death Company units. And, Death Company are much cheaper than Wraith Blades. So, it doesn't really make a lot of sense that they'd be able to wipe out so many of them. But it's because of this detachment bonus and some of the other buffs that they can get from their stratagems. Now, I will say, while this is very powerful, it doesn't help the mobility of the Blood Angels. Blood Angels are pretty mobile as is, but they don't really have any extra stratagems or anything like that that allow them to advance and charge and so forth. So this is the point of weakness of this detachment. It gives them great combat ability, and it's probably the best one to run in competitive play, but it does make them a little bit slower, and you can use that to your advantage. Now, of course, this is something you have to be aware of, but it often doesn't come into play with certain unit interactions. And, in my game in particular, really didn't come into play that often either. That is Armor of Contempt. So that just worsens the AP characteristic of your attacks by 1. Basically, every single Space Marine detachment has this, and it is something that is very common. So, just be aware of that, but doesn't really help against a lot of our higher AP shooting. So the next stratagem is Red Rampage, which is absolutely insane for 1 CP. Most stratagems will give you one of these bonuses, not both, but this one just gives you both for 1 CP, and that is Lance and Lethal Hits. And that's pretty insane if you think about putting this on a unit of Death Company who are already getting a bunch of buffs from either Astarath or Lamartas. And the stratagem will mean that not even Wraith Guard are safe. And to be honest, not even the Avatar of Cain is safe against this type of ability, right? When you have Lance, lethal hits, strength 10, even against a Fortuned Avatar, they're still going to hit you pretty hard. For quite frankly, a lot less points. So this is the stratagem to watch out for your bigger units. Luckily, in the game I played, because of the type of list I was running, I really didn't care too much about this stratagem, as it was often overkill anyway. If any of my Aspect Warriors got caught by Death Company, they were very, very dead anyhow. Now, the next one is a Fights on Death stratagem. It is 2 command points. It does allow a unit to fight on death automatically, no rolls required, so no 4-up rolls required here. But it is 2 CP. It's quite expensive. And if your opponent is worrying about other stuff on the battlefield, or maybe even drew a bad secondary one turn and needs to swap that out for a CP, they're often not going to have enough CP to use this one every turn. So this is something you have to keep in the back of your mind, but it's not something that's going to be a constant threat every single turn, because your opponent is simply not going to have the CP for it at all times. Okay, so the next option for the Blood Angels is the Stormlance Task Force. That's the next detachment that they can choose from that is beneficial to their units. Basically, it just gives your units advance and charge. So you can declare a charge in a turn in which they advanced or fell back. Now, this is a very good detachment roll, but the stratagems for it are basically all based around mounted units, which the Blood Angels don't really have much of. And of course, they could always, bring bikes and stuff like that, but, those aren't their best units. So typically speaking, this is just kind of taken as a really strong detachment that doesn't have a lot of stratagem support. Now, this does make Blood Angels much faster. It allows them to get off turn charges much easier, but at the same time, they're not going to be hitting as hard. So that is something that can work in your favor as well. And to give you a quick example of why this matters, our vehicles are actually toughness 9, and Power Fists and even Thunder Hammers are strength 8. So they're going to have trouble punching through those vehicles on charge with their units of Death Company and stuff like that. So if they're running this detachment, yes, they will get into combat much easier, but at the same time, the bigger targets that would, basically allow them to trade effectively, the Death Company, are going to be a lot harder to crack, and therefore they need that extra strength and those extra attacks to be able to pop through those units. So most of the time, I think people are going to go with the Sons of Sanguinius detachment for those, extra attacks and strength, but occasionally you will have somebody that goes for this for that extra threat range. Now, the one thing I will say about this detachment is it has a really good enhancement in case, your opponent takes a chaplain with a unit of Death Company or something like that, and basically allows you to reroll advance rolls made for that unit. So, you don't have to worry about rolling a 1 on your advance, which does give them a lot better threat range in general. Okay, so moving on to the strongest Blood Angels units, they are as follows. The Jump Pack Intercessors, which are pretty good trading units, and I'll talk about them in a second. They have the Death Company with or without jetpacks. Both of them are good. Blade Guard Veterans, of course, Aggressors, the Ball Predator, the Land Raider Redeemer, Lamartes, and Astaroth. So Jump Pack Intercessors are your basic Jump Pack Marines. They're fast with movement 12 and fly. They have good damage against infantry with their chain swords and can punch up with the Sons of Sanguinius bonus. So they're getting, strength 6 on charge and a bunch of attacks. They also deal mortal wounds on a 4+ to models they're engaged with when charging. Now, keep in mind, the way this ability is worded means they need to be within 1 inch of your models. So if they're not within 1 inch, they're not going to get that mortal wound bonus. So on long charges, typically they're only going to get a few, and this ability really only hits home hard against units that they're fully engaged with. Even so, Jump Pack Intercessors are only 80 points per unit, which is pretty cheap for a Marine unit, and on top of being cheap, they're really fast, so we're good at scoring secondaries and, eliminating your more fragile units. Now, some of the Aeldari counters we have to these guys are the Solitaire, Wind Riders, Howling Banshees, Striking Scorpions, and the Troop. Now, I just want to make this clear right away. If either Howling Banshees or Striking Scorpions get the charge on the Intercessors, the Banshees and the Scorpions will win. Okay, unless you roll really bad, they're going to win on average dice. A lot of people have argued this point in the comments and stuff like that, but it's just simply not true. The math doesn't add up, and the experiences that I've had with striking Scorpions and Howling Banshees often result in the unit of, Marine equivalents dying a horrible death. Or at the very least, losing the trade over the course of one round. Now, on the other hand, the Solitaire, while it doesn't trade up against these guys, is a great target for heroic intervention and can quickly dispatch them if they do charge into something more fragile nearby. The Troop with the Troop Master, again, is more expensive, but they will easily wipe out the Intercessors on the charge as well. And of course, Wind Riders are just good at killing Marine equivalents in general, so of course they make the grade there. The next unit that we have to talk about is the Death Company. Now, these could be with or without jetpacks. They are armed to the teeth. They either have Power Fists and Inferno Pistols or Thunder Hammers. Again, both of which hit very hard with the Sons of Sanguinius Detachment. They're very fast, again, with Movement 12 and Fly, and they reroll hit rolls and charge rolls. So they're very reliable in combat and getting to combat as well. Now, something I didn't mention here also is they have a 6-up Feel No Pain, which is not nothing, and it is something that comes up more often than you would think. However, the counters to these units largely remain the same. The Solitaire will still easily be able to rip through a bunch of them, especially on Blitz turn. Wind Riders will be able to rip through them quite easily. Fire Dragons are very good into them, and in fact, kind of nullifies their Feel No Pain. Fuegan is also very good into them because not only can he kill them at shooting, but he can also kill them in close combat pretty effectively. And again, the Troop with the Troop Master, just because of those dev wounds. And, dev wounds are typically very strong against high armor enemies. And then we come to Blade Guard Veterans. So Blade Guard Veterans are a different kind of beast because they come with invul saves. So they're very tough. They have a 4+ invul save and 3 wounds a pop, which make them durable against damage to weapons. And they can get a 5-up Feel No Pain from the Sanguinary Priests. They also have solid damage as well in close combat. Probably not as strong as the Death Company, but they're definitely more durable in exchange. So the counters to these guys are still going to be Wind Riders are probably our best option. They are a little bit more durable, but again, when you're forcing so many armor saves on your opponent, they're going to fail some, and you're going to kill some Blade Guard Veterans with those Wind Riders, especially if they're in a big pack. Fire Dragons are also very good into them because Blade Guard Vets are expensive, and for every failed invul, that's going to be a dead Blade Guard. Fuegan is also pretty good into them just because he has a damage 3 weapon, so, the Feel No Pain is sort of a problem, but if you're able to eliminate that Feel No Pain, Fuegan is pretty good into these units. Troop with Troop Master is also pretty good because they deal a bunch of devastating wounds, again, and they have grenades. You can throw a grenade in there, you can charge in, re-rolling your wounds out of a Falcon, you can do quite a bit of damage for, much less points than the Blade Guard Veterans are. So, if you have a Falcon firing a Pulse Laser, Bright Lance, and Shuriken Cannon at them, and then you, throw a grenade, charge the Troop Master in, you're probably going to kill quite a bit of them and, at the very least, tie them up for a round and prevent them from killing other units in your army. Aggressors are another unit that is very strong in Blood Angels because they're a combat unit, but they also have Flamers. They also actually have the ability to have some pretty good Overwatch. So they're armed with twin-linked flamers and power fists, and they're pretty tough against bolter-type shooting like shuriken catapults and stuff with toughness 6 and 3 wounds, but they don't have an invul save, so that is their downfall. And of course, this means that their greatest counters are Fire Dragons and Wind Riders. Wind Riders, being able to wound them on 4s, make them a good unit to be able to deal with them fairly easily, especially in large volumes, and Fire Dragons just absolutely melt them. If Fire Dragons are able to get into them unmolested, Fire Dragons will make short work of them. The only thing that you have to watch out for, again, is that twin-linked Overwatch, which is really oppressive, but if you bait an Overwatch somewhere else on the battlefield, these guys won't be able to do it. So you kind of have to think about it that way. The Ball Predator is the next unit that the Blood Angels have, and it's a very powerful unit. It's pretty cheap at 125 points. It's very fast and can advance and shoot at infantry, but not at mounted units, vehicles, or monsters. So keep that in mind, that your opponent doesn't have the ability to always advance and shoot. It's only at infantry targets. And of course, I think the scariest thing about this is it comes with potentially 3 flamers. The Ball Flamestorm Cannon is very powerful and can really put a hurt on our more fragile units, including Wind Riders. So you do have to watch out for that and make sure that this is not in range to shoot at them. So the Aeldari counters into the Ball Predator happen to be the Falcon, Fire Prisms, Warwalkers, and Fuegan. Now, the reason I don't mention Fire Dragons in particular is because they're very weak to the Overwatch that the Ball Predator has, and they will probably all get, fried if they try. However, Fire Dragons can still do decent damage to it, but only if your opponent has already Overwatched that turn. Warwalkers, Fuegan, Fire Prisms, and of course the Falcon can all sustain or withstand the Overwatch from the Ball Predator or just outrange it. So these are all good units to take that thing out. The next vehicle in the Blood Angels arsenal that is a very common pick is the Land Raider Redeemer, simply because it doesn't have just one Flamestorm cannon, but two. So absolutely armed to the teeth. It's very tough and durable. And on top of that, it can transport models with the assault ramp, allowing them to charge after disembarking, which of course is what Blood Angels want to do. And I think the biggest counters to these are Skyweavers, because they can kind of dip over the Overwatch, because the Overwatch is 18 inches. They have a 24-inch Haywire cannon, so can easily kind of skirt that. Fuegan's very good against it, because he could just do 12 damage to it. And again, typically survives the Overwatch because of his good armor save and feel no pain. Fire Prisms as well are pretty good against Land Raiders if you can draw a bead on them, and Warwalkers are decent options also. Now, as we go into the characters that the Blood Angels have that you have to watch out for, these are going to be joined by Death Company usually. So Lamartez is a Death Company chaplain that gives -1 damage to the unit. So, Shuriken Cannons are now only dealing damage 1. It's a very powerful defensive buff. And on top of that, he gives lethal hits to the melee weapons of the unit he joins. But again, good counters to this guy are the Solitaire, Wind Riders, Fuegan, and Fire Dragons. Basically, if you hit a unit of Death Company, at least a small one with any of these units, then they're going to go down pretty quickly. Asterath is another great character for the Death Company. He gives his units Fight on Death on a 4+, which is very strong, and once per game he gives his units devastating wounds on their melee weapons, which makes them even more powerful than they were before. However, the counters remain the same because these guys are going to be joined to units of Death Company. Both the Solitaire, Wind Riders, Fire Dragons, and Fuegan are all going to be very effective into them. Okay, so now for probably the most important part of the whole video, and that is the effective strategies to employ when going up against Blood Angels. So, like I said before, we can know the units that are good against the Blood Angels, but if we're not able to bring them into contact easily, or the Blood Angels just rush us all at once and, we kind of die in the first couple of turns, those matchups aren't ever going to be able to happen. And for every one of the units that I listed as a possible counter to the Blood Angels units, if the Blood Angels charge into them, they will die and the counter is gone. Right? Fire Dragons, Wind Riders, all of those units that I mentioned are most likely going to die horrible deaths if charged by a Blood Angels unit. And that is why screening or move blocking is probably one of the most important strategies to employ against Blood Angels when fighting against them. But also, as a backup, having a heroic intervention unit with fights first nearby. Because, Blood Angels do have fly. They are able to charge over your models, and sometimes they will make a big charge and be able to get around your screens. And when that happens, having a backup, a heroic intervening unit, with fights first, like the Solitaire, can be a saving grace. Powerful Overwatch is, of course, a great tactic, especially if your opponent has to charge you down a lane that you have line of sight on. That can prevent your opponent from moving where he wants to move on the battlefield. And lastly, making effective trades can make it very hard for your opponent to strike back effectively as well. So as for screening or move blocking, striking Scorpions are really good at this because not only can they alpha strike if you go first to tie up enemy units or neutralize them before they can act, but they can also screen for you as well. Rangers are even better at screening because they can reposition themselves in a way where even units with fly might have trouble charging their intended target. Again, if you screen to the point where you're moving closer to the unit that they're going to charge, you can make it very hard for them to actually get through. Your opponent will probably have to declare a multi-charge, and if your opponent can't make contact with both units, then the charge fails. So again, Rangers can make it more difficult for your opponent to charge the units that they want to charge. Falcons can also block movement lanes, preventing units from moving into position in the first place. And Falcons are pretty long, so they can block, between ruins and stuff like that. It might not seem like that big of a deal. But if you're late in the game and your opponent only has a couple of tools left to be able to kill as much as possible, then moving a Falcon in between and allowing your fire dragons and other units to survive can sometimes make the difference. So Falcons are a good unit for this as well. And also, if you have one, a Wave Serpent, because a Wave Serpent not only has a 5+ invulnerable save, but actually is a little bit bigger than a Falcon as well, so is able to take up more space on the battlefield. Heroic Intervention with a Fights First unit is excellent as well. The Solitaire easily destroys 5-man Marine equivalent units, and Howling Banshees can kill an average of 3 Marines on a Heroic Intervention, trading effectively, and also just, that might be enough to take the wind out of their sails. Troops with the Visarch can also clean up Marine equivalents quite easily because the troop is, pretty decent at it, but the Visarch with Fights First and, of course, Strength 5, AP -4 attacks with sustained hits or devastating wounds, whichever suits you, is going to make quick work of those units also. Powerful Overwatch, like I've stated, is a great way to deal with charging armies. Wind Riders have great Overwatch when in large units, and with Guide, which is of course going to allow them to reroll hits with sustained hits, which is extremely strong. Warp Spiders also have pretty decent Overwatch as well against smaller Marine equivalent units after having shot said unit. And in my experience, they usually kill around 3 Space Marines on a good Overwatch, between the 3 devastating wounds that they can deal and the ton of armor saves that they will force on the unit. They're probably looking at about 2 or 3 Marine kills, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it does help the Warp Spiders to eliminate at least one threat from your opponent on the battlefield. And lastly, we have to talk about making effective trades. So Marine units are generally significantly more expensive than Eldar aspect units. Fire Dragons, for example, cost 90 points and Death Company costs 140. And the Dragons come out significantly better off if they make the first attack. And also, don't forget, Fire Dragons have grenades. So with a reroll to hit and a reroll to wound, 5 Fire Dragons can very easily wipe out 5 Death Company Marines with the grenade stratagem. Striking Scorpions also kill about 3 Marines on average rolls, while Howling Banshees kill about 3 as well, so they trade evenly also. And a lot of players I know will say this, and I've said this probably about 100 times by now. Striking Scorpions and Howling Banshees can easily trade up with Marine equivalent units. The math supports it, the points cost supports it, and that's all you guys need to know. Yes, Howling Banshees and Striking Scorpions are not going to typically be able to punch up that effectively into Terminator-type units. But then again, they really shouldn't have to or be able to, because they're extremely cheap, right? So a 65-point unit should not be able to, kill a 175-point or 180-point unit by itself. That's ridiculous. Even with synergies, that just shouldn't be able to happen. But you throw Cahandras in there, or, you throw more Striking Scorpions in there, and you start to see a little bit of a different picture. And just remember, for every unit of Terminators your opponent can deploy, you can deploy almost 3 units of Striking Scorpions in return. So yeah, the Scorpions might not be able to take the Terminators on one-on-one, but you have more units, right? You have more coverage, and that is a strength of its own. Okay, so now I want to go into my recent experience against Blood Angels and what I learned in that game. And like I said before, I will go into more of the details about what exactly happened in the battle in a video probably coming out tomorrow. So let's take a look at the 2 lists. My list included an Autarch Wayleaper with basically the, all the good stuff. So Dragon Fusion Gun, Starglaive, and Howling Banshee Mask, as well as the Phoenix Gem. I had a Farseer Skyrunner, a Warlock Skyrunner, Fuegan, and the Solitaire for my characters. For Battle Line, I had Storm Guardians, of course. I also had 3 units of Fire Dragons, 2 units of Striking Scorpions, 5 Swooping Hawks, 5 Warp Spiders, 3 Shroud Runners, 9 Wind Riders, and 3 Falcons. For his list, and I think this is what he had basically in general, but, correct me if my points are off or something like that. I didn't actually ask him for his list. but I kind of remembered what he had. So he had Asterath, Lamartez, he had a Chaplain, a Sanguinary Priest, and both of those are going to go with the Blade Guard veterans in the Land Raider. He had an Intercessor squad, 3 units of 5 Assault Intercessors with jump packs, 6 Blade Guard veterans, 5 Death Company Marines with jump packs. He had 3 units of those. He had 3 Inceptors. He had a Land Raider Redeemer, a Predator Annihilator, an Impulsor, and a Calidus Assassin. Alrighty, so like I said, I am going to give you guys a brief overview of the game and basically what happened in general, but the more specifics will be in a future video. So first off, looking at the deployment, we have the Sweeping Engagement deployment with, I believe, terrain layout number 2. I personally like this terrain layout the best because I think it has, the best balance for both shooting and melee armies. But what I especially love about this map is that initially it seems like it's really good for melee armies because the deployment zones are really close together, but because of the new Pariah Nexus mission rules and the tournament pack that GW released, they actually stated that a model could not make a charge if it can't fit within the ruin walls. So you can actually place your models just outside of 1 inch of the ruin walls on the inside of the walls, and your opponent will not be able to engage you from the other side of the ruin wall. And because they can't fit inside of the ruin wall, they have to go around. So this can make charges very difficult if you place your models correctly, which is going to be a key factor in the game I played against my buddy. Now, this is basically where we ended up deploying. I have everything labeled here, but starting from the left on his side, he had Jump Intercessors, Death Company with Lamartez, a Land Raider Redeemer, Predator Annihilator, Intercessors, Death Company with Asterath, an Impulsor, another squad of Death Company solo, and Jump Intercessors. He also had a Calidus Assassin that infiltrated up the battlefield right in front. On my side of the battlefield, starting from the left side, I have Swooping Hawks in my deployment zone on the left, Striking Scorpions up on the left-hand flank. I have Striking Scorpions more in the middle of the battlefield opposite the Land Raider Redeemer. In my own deployment zone, I have a huge unit of Wind Riders deployed right there. I have an Autarch Wayleaper, 2 Falcons, the Solitaire, Storm Guardians, Shroud Runners, all hidden from line of sight, of course. A unit of Warp Spiders on the other side of that ruin in the center of my deployment zone, and there was a really obvious reason why I put them there. It was to kill the Calidus Assassin if I was able to get first turn, and of course they were out of charge range of the rest of his units, so I knew my Warp Spiders would at least survive the first turn, and Falcon with Fuegan and Fire Dragons on the right-hand side. And of course, the other 2 Falcons have Fire Dragons in them as well. So like I said, I will go into more detail about this battle and about why I deployed the units where I did in a future video, probably again coming out after this video tomorrow. But I want to keep it short and quick and give you guys a little bit of a, hot take on why this deployment worked so well, which I actually didn't think would work as well as it did, but it ended up working, so I want to share that success with you guys. So first of all, I want to mention that the Striking Scorpions units, while they may seem kind of out there in the wind if my opponent gets a first turn, are positioned in such a way that my opponent has to reveal one of his more expensive units to be able to kill them. So what my opponent either has to do here to get rid of the Striking Scorpions in the middle is he either has to use the Death Company from Lamartez, which is an extremely expensive unit, and if you look right there, if he charges those Striking Scorpions, they're going to die the next turn. He either has to do that or move the Land Raider Redeemer into the middle of the battlefield right away. And of course, if he does this, I can always just Phantasm to the other side of that L-shaped ruin to my left. Now, I know it doesn't seem like this in the diagram that I did, and it's not exactly to scale here, but my Scorpions were close enough to that other side of the ruin to where a roll of a 2 would put them on the other side of it and out of line of sight. So my opponent, of course, didn't want to really risk that if he did get first turn, but as fate would have it, he didn't. He actually went second. So again, although the Striking Scorpions do look like in a weird position, they are there for a reason. Now, the Striking Scorpions on the left side are simply to stop the Jump Intercessors from going into the area behind that first wall right there to make it hard for me to kind of shoot them and stuff. So I put them there basically to bait them into either charging the Striking Scorpions, or like I said, if I get the first turn, the Striking Scorpions will be able to charge in and deal a killing blow to them instead. Other than that, my battle plan was essentially to move the Shroud Runners out and the Wind Riders out of terrain, and I'll show you what the first turn ended up looking like because I did actually end up going first. Okay, so this was the first turn. I did win the roll-off, which meant that I was able to move up the Striking Scorpions on the left flank, up to the Jump Intercessors, and tie them up. I actually killed 4 of those models. The Sergeant swung back and killed 1, but I had easily won that trade there on the left, which was actually pretty big, and it had a significant impact on the rest of the game, believe it or not. But, I'll talk about that in the future video that I do on the battle itself. The Striking Scorpions in the middle were able to move up behind that wall with their movement, and then charge the Land Raider Redeemer from out of line of sight so that it couldn't overwatch. And for you guys wondering why the Redeemer didn't just overwatch them, he just didn't have line of sight to me at any point, right? I moved up, he didn't have line of sight. I charged, he didn't have line of sight in the beginning of the charge, and by the end of the charge, I was already engaged with him. And as you guys know, or don't know, Big Guns Never Tire doesn't allow you to shoot outside of your own shooting phase. So you can't use Big Guns Never Tire to fire Overwatch. Other than that, on the right side of the battlefield, my Warp Spiders moved up behind that ruin wall, shot the Calidus Assassin, and killed it, and also was in Overwatch range of all 3 of his units in his deployment zone on the right-hand side of the battlefield, which did make it a little bit tricky for him to actually maneuver after that because, being overwatched by Warp Spiders is a little bit scary. I also moved the Swooping Hawks on the left to score extend enemy battle lines, and of course the rest of my army kind of just shimmied around and positioned themselves better for the next turn. So Falcons moved up a little bit, the Wind Riders moved behind the L-shaped ruin on the right-hand side, the Shroud Runners moved out, took some shots at Lamard's unit, actually ended up killing 1 Death Company Marine, which is kind of funny. And the Falcon with Fuegan on the right-hand side just stayed right there because I knew the Death Company, Jump Intercessors, and maybe even another unit of Death Company were en route. So I wanted to make sure that Fuegan could get out, Fire Dragons could get out, Falcon could shoot at them, and basically eliminate that threat on the right flank. Because as of now, the Falcon was pretty safe behind that ruin and had no real threat of getting charged that turn. Now, what I will say from here is that I basically prevented my opponent from getting the jump on me. I put him in a very tricky position in the first turn to where he had to deal with not only the Striking Scorpions on the left flank, the Striking Scorpions engaging the Land Raider Redeemer, but also the Warp Spiders that had, kind of crept up and eliminated the Calidus Assassin. So my opponent was now clearly on the back foot, and as such had to put out a couple of fires before they could move into a better position. Now, I think the move that really won me the early game was the Striking Scorpions charging the Redeemer. My opponent said that there was no other place that he could have possibly put his Redeemer on this deployment zone type and on this board, kind of terrain layout. And I totally understand that. However, if it was me, I wouldn't have placed them that close to the edge of my deployment zone. I know he wanted to be aggressive if he got first turn, but if he didn't get first turn, they were going to automatically get tied up by the Striking Scorpion. So I just don't think that was the best placement, but it's where a lot of Marine players will put their Land Raider because, the Land Raider is just so tough, right? And all the defensive stratagems it has, like popping smoke or Armor of Contempt, it's really difficult to bring down in the first turn if you don't have the right tools for it. And really, I didn't really have much in the way of tools to deal with it in the first turn. So, I didn't shoot at it or anything like that. I knew my best strategy here was to tie it up. However, I have to say, if he did move it the first turn up in the middle of the battlefield like he said he was going to, I would have had a lot of firepower at that point that would have been able to deal with it effectively. But again, I would have also had to deal with Overwatch, so that is a bit of a problem as well. So I will go into the rest of the battle later, but essentially this put my opponent in a really difficult position from the start of the battle, and I was able to dictate the course of the battle from here. And as you can see, wherever my opponent moves their units, they're going to be threatened by something in my army, either by Fuegan and the Fire Dragons on the right flank, or by the Wind Riders in the middle, or even on the left flank with the Fire Dragons that can then get out and shoot as well. And the bottom line here is that none of his units are really fully safe. Now, he did have Inceptors in Deep Strike, and he also had a unit of Intercessors or Assault Intercessors with Jump Packs in Deep Strike as well. but they didn't really have a huge impact on the battle again because they had to actually be used on his turn 2 to put out fires from the units that were giving him the most trouble. And throughout the battle, I just made sure to make it as hard as possible for his Death Company to make good trades on my units. So, if I don't have a unit that is cheaper, that is going to trade more effectively, I have a unit that can revive himself, like Fuegan, right? So my opponent ended up not having a very good time dealing with this style of army. So yeah, Blood Angels are a really powerful army, and their units are absolute bulldozers. But if you don't allow their units to get the charges that they want to get, if you put your opponent on the back foot right away, or bait them into making charges that are going to leave their units open to counterattack, then there's not much that they can actually do. And Blood Angels, they have a little bit of shooting here and there, but it's not too much. A lot of their shooting is very low range, and it's mostly going to be Overwatch based. Things like flamers and stuff like that. I mean, he had one Predator Annihilator in his list, and I never really gave him a good opportunity to shoot at Falcons until later on in the game, when it was basically already decided, and I was starting to swing the primary game around in my favor. So what did I learn? Well, I basically learned that while Death Company are very hard hitting, as long as you position your units so they can't multi-charge your own units, you will typically out-trade them pretty effectively. I also learned that a well-positioned Solitaire is super difficult for your opponent to deal with, and it's a big deterrent. Your opponent's not going to want to charge something with your Solitaire right next to it. My Solitaire actually didn't have to do much. He basically acted as a deterrent, and then later on in the game, he did eliminate and clean up some of the units that he brought via Deep Strike, like the Inceptors and the Assault Intercessors. Also, let the Death Star, because basically every Space Marine Assault Army is going to have some sort of tough Death Star that they're going to ram down the center of the battlefield. Let their Death Star just take the center while you fight around the edges of the battlefield. And in fact, if you can, and you get first turn, use one of your Striking Scorpions units or Rangers units to just run up to them and tie them up in close combat. As long as you are behind a wall or something like that to make sure that you don't get overwatched, a Land Raider Redeemer is very big and very unmaneuverable. And trust me, yes, your opponent can, make a desperate escape test and run through you, but if he rolls that 1, he's cooked. And most of the time, your opponent is not going to want to risk the entire game on a single dice roll. And just, also not being able to shoot after you get out of combat is still worth it, in my opinion, for whatever 55 or 65 points you spent on the Striking Scorpions and Rangers to be able to do that in the first place. So, of course, the tactic with these Death Star style units is just ignore them for the first couple of turns, delay if possible, and then when they do finally get out, then pounce, right? And lastly, always have a unit poised to heroically intervene or overwatch. That's very powerful as well. There were several moments in this game where my opponent simply couldn't move where he wanted to move because either Wind Riders were there or I had a Solitaire nearby who could heroically intervene. So do keep those things in mind as well. So in conclusion, while Blood Angels do hit extremely hard, there are ways to mitigate their Alpha Strike capabilities by either using the Ruin Walls trick that I told you about earlier in this video, or by diverting their forces away from your vulnerable units by presenting bait-style units that your opponent must take out or risk getting assaulted themselves. The key, of course, to that strategy is to position your units in such a way that the more expensive Blood Angels units will open themselves up to attack after charging, and then it's all about making efficient trades. Which is why I really have come to respect units in this kind of mission pack like Rangers and Striking Scorpions more so, because your opponent has to deal with them. But at the same time, when your opponent deals with them because Striking Scorpions are rather cheap, that can set up other units in your army to make very efficient trades. So, things like Death Company coming out and killing your Striking Scorpions means that Fire Dragons or a Falcon can then counterattack and kill them quite easily. If your opponent is taking Space Wolves, you can use a very similar tactic as well with their Wolfen units and their units of Thunderwolf Cavalry. Their Thunderwolves are going to have to deal with the Scorpions, right? Now, I'm going to make a video on Space Wolves later on, so I don't have all the details for you ready right now, but I think the same tactics can be used against Space Wolves as you can use against Blood Angels. And I actually think that Space Wolves might be a little bit easier to deal with than Blood Angels are because of the fact that their Space Wolf, Thunderwolf Cavalry are mounted units, and mounted units can't really charge through ruins that well. So that is something that can really work to your advantage if you can really work those line of sight lanes and firing lanes. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and let me know what you guys think in the comment section below about the different strategies that you can employ against Blood Angels, or if you have some ideas of your own, let me know as well. I'd absolutely love to hear your thoughts on it, whether they are salty or not. Also, want to give a big thanks to my patrons and supporters who have helped the channel over the last year and a half plus now. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly, so thank you so much for that. Also, if you did want to consider supporting the channel yourself, I have free trials activated on my Patreon, which will give you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who like talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, or you want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel on the channel store page, I will leave the links for those in the description also. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching once again, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.